Hello and welcome to the first episode of Treasures of China, in which I'll ask the question about the current extent of China's tangible cultural heritage. First, I will try to decipher a number of myths about China's heritage. So, let's start. Myth number 1. There are hardly any old buildings left in China. This is definitely a myth, although we have to admit that China's heritage has suffered tremendously. I'd even say that the destructions during the last 2 centuries have resulted in the single biggest loss of cultural treasures in the history of mankind. Still, China's heritage is alive and still so huge that it's an indicator for just how big of a cultural nation Imperial China was. Currently, even with the still ongoing process of protecting it, there are at least 1 million protected sites within its borders. Now, of course, this should be a much higher number, but let's face it, regarding the dramatic history since the beginning of the 19th century, its current state and extent is almost a miracle. Myth number 2. The communists have destroyed most ancient buildings in China. Contrary to public opinion, this is a myth. While we can't deny the huge losses of cultural sites during the 50s and the Cultural Revolution, and even during the modernization that came after it, there were many other forces and movements responsible for the losses. As you probably know, China was gripped by numerous rebellions during the 19th century, not to mention several imperialistic incursions, most notably by the UK and France. The most dramatic of them was the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1851 to 1864. And while this catastrophic event in Chinese history is mostly noted for its enormous death toll, we should not forget the horrible effects on China's tangible heritage. In the ideology, which included different influences, including a shocking misunderstanding of Christianity, there was a strong aversion for China's traditional ideologies, as well as for China's ruling elite, the Manchu, and the ruling imperial house. This led to widespread destructions, especially in the Yangtze area. Very few cities in this area, then the most sophisticated and wealthy region of the empire, have retained their architectural glory. For example, the two glorious cities of Nanjing and Hangzhou both lost basically all of their original wooden buildings, and are huge disappointments for everyone in search of these cities' unique past. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't travel there. On the contrary, I love both cities, but for different reasons. Later on, many further wars led to huge losses, especially the Chinese civil wars of the 1920s, 30s and 40s, and last but not least, World War II, where especially Chinese national heritage, its Taoist and folk religious temples, were a prime target for parts of the attacking forces. After 1949, the new government wasn't exactly focused on rebuilding or preserving what was left. But until the Cultural Revolution, the destruction of traditional buildings happened at a limited scope. In fact, the 1950s and 1960s saw the origin of China's heritage protection, an enterprise that was disrupted by the Great Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976, but is still ongoing. The Cultural Revolution itself accounted for serious losses, especially when it came to religious symbols like statues, which were often destroyed, while the surrounding buildings were left unharmed. After 1976, the increasing modernization of China has further increased the pressures on traditional structures. But at the same time, it has seen the rescue and restoration of many important monuments, while an enormous amount of them waits for renovation. Myth number 3. Chinese temples have lost their interiors, the murals, and the statues. Now this is, sadly, mostly true. This horrible development started with the Taiping Rebellion, when religious and Confucian temples became a prime target for destruction. but it reached its height during the Cultural Revolution, when countless statues were destroyed. Others, and this includes important murals, were simply sold overseas by impoverished monks after the collapse of the empire, and can now be viewed in American, Japanese, or European collections. Some were brought to Chinese museums as well, but a significant part was lost after 1976 and was simply stolen and moved to Hong Kong and international art dealers. This trend has been fought in recent years, but there are still cases of theft. The losses of so many statues, paintings, altars, and other objects is especially regrettable when considering the genius of Chinese art. One might only guess what the world has lost. But not all has been destroyed. Quite a number of temples have been preserved with the full interiors, and these are some of the treasures I want to explore in this series. Myth number 4. There are hardly any old towns left. This is a common misconception that doesn't consider the huge differences inside China. While it is true that there are regrettably few old towns left in certain provinces, others like Shanxi, Sichuan or Zhejiang still have an abundance of old towns and villages which are not only remarkably intact, but so far have been spared of becoming tourist traps. Although these quiet, authentic towns are becoming fewer and fewer, they do exist and will be one of the major themes of this series. Myth number 5. If you want to visit true Chinese architecture, you have to go to Japan. Now, there's an emphatic no to this suggestion. But before I go on, let me tell you that I encourage everyone to go to Japan to see the Chinese architecture and its influence on what I call Sino-Japanese and traditional Japanese architecture. But you might have heard sentences like, "Such a Chinese temple doesn't exist in China anymore." And that is absolutely not true, with one major exception. If you want to see the oldest example of a Chinese temple, you have to go to Japan, to Ikaruga near Nara to be precise. It is there that you will find Horyuji, a gorgeous, unique temple from the late 7th and the early 8th century. That will give you an idea of how early Tang and even pre-Tang temples in China have looked like. But apart from that, Japan has absorbed a lot of cultural influences from China, notably its architecture, and has accommodated it in different Japanese ways. But since Japan was always more conservative than China, China has developed numerous architectural styles you will only find here, and they are definitely worth exploring. So much for now. I hope you liked this topic and will join me for the second part of it, where I will take a look at where China's heritage is mostly preserved. See you!